He had been subjected to torture. My father was kidnapped again in January 2018, this time while traveling on a train with Swedish diplomats. And since then, he has again been held incommunicado. In February this year, he was sentenced in secret to 10 years in prison for illegally providing intelligence overseas. It has not been explained what specific acts this refers to. Chinese authorities further claim that my father has renounced his Swedish citizenship and applied to have his Chinese citizenship reinstated. And as such, the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs have been refused information even on his health status. I have not spoken to him since early 2018 and have no way of knowing if he is still alive. My father's case is increasingly a precursor to China's repression of freedoms in Hong Kong through its recent national security law. Though in violation of Hong Kong's own basic law as well as international law, this legislation is the Chinese government's way of ensuring that what happened to my father can now legally be done to anyone in Hong Kong. Article 38 of the law indicates that it is intended to extend beyond the territory of Hong Kong to apply to anyone, anywhere. The national security law has institutionalized China's extraterritorial abduction of political dissidents, and this suggests to me that while the efforts of countries like Canada and Sweden to respond to Beijing's human rights violations have been important, they sadly have not been enough. Canada is home to a large Chinese and Hong Kong Chinese community, and I wonder how many of these people feel forced, like I do, to take extra security precautions daily in order to protect themselves from Chinese government harassment. To honor its commitment to human rights, then, Canada should make sure that its citizens and residents can safely express their opinions on China without having to fear harassment, intimidation, or abduction. This is especially important as Hong Kong activists are relocating to Canada for fear of their safety. Canada should also urgently move to protect Canadian citizens in Hong Kong whose health and safety was threatened by the Chinese ambassador last week. And as we have seen in my father's case, China now claims the authority to unilaterally change foreign citizens' nationality, completely undermining the protection that foreign citizenship used to provide. And in taking these steps, Canada will set an important standard for other countries to follow and provide a basis for increased transnational cooperation in holding Beijing accountable. To prevent what happened to my father from becoming the norm, the international community must act more swiftly and with more coordination than it hitherto has. I therefore also want to call on Canada to work with Sweden and other countries by clearly and publicly demanding Beijing's adherence to international law, by stating their refusal to cooperate with extraterritorial application of the national security law, as well as by demanding my father's release. Since condemnations have not been effective in the past, it is of paramount importance that demands also articulate consequences. I understand that reconsidering the relationship to China is not a decision to be taken lightly. However, as extraterritorial abductions of political dissidents are becoming normalized, it ought to be a price that we are willing to pay. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you, and I will welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Law.
Thank you very much, Chairman Regan. It's my honor to be able to testify in front of the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. As we all are aware, the Hong Kong we used to know is gone now. After 1 year of protests and the dreadful response from the authority, the popularity of the Hong Kong government has dropped to historical low, and the confidence of Hong Kong people towards the one country, two system ruling framework has basically vanished. While the situation looks grim for Hong Kong, the Beijing authority made it worse by circumventing all of our consultation and legislative processes to impose the notorious national security law, which was, to us, a de facto final nail in the coffin of the one country, two system.
Mr. Law, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm being asked if you could hold your microphone a little closer to your mouth as the interpreters are having difficulty. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Okay, thank you so much. Is it better now?
I think that's much better. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With the draconian national security law, Beijing has the arbitrary power to detain, arrest, and prosecute any political activists or dissidents that they don't like. Carrie Lam says that the law is only intended to target violent protesters. This is a blatant lie. The sole purpose of the law is to quash our freedom of expression, any desires for political change, and the right to protest. It has created a widespread psychological terror and fear across the city. Up until now, over 30 people have been arrested under the law. Indeed, international media has covered the arrest of my dearest friend, fellow activist Agnes Chow, and the democratic veteran Jimmy Lai, who runs a pro-democracy news outlet in Hong Kong. High-profile activists like them were arrested as a retaliation towards the sanctioning from the US government towards 11 Hong Kong and China officials who are responsible for the human rights violation in Hong Kong. However, arrests are not limited to those of the high profiles. Ordinary youngsters have also been arrested simply for possessing flags or stickers with protest slogans during arbitrary stop and searches in the city. These cases demonstrate the use of the law to terrorize and deprive Hong Kong people on all levels from the most fundamental rights, and as a legal weapon for the Beijing. By setting up these examples and abusing such a vaguely defined law, a sense of fear and white terror has permeated our entire society. Some of my friends are actively disengaging from political life and deleting Facebook posts due to the fear of being prosecuted under the national security law. Academics are self-censoring and eliminating research topics that may be considered as crossing the red line. Reporters are worried that they are no longer able to cover certain sensitive topics. But this does not stop at Hong Kong. Recent reports have also indicated signs of academics and students in the Western countries' academic institutions engaging in self-censorship, either for the fear of dangers when they visit Hong Kong and China, or due to strong funding ties to CCP-linked donors. Hong Kong is simply the first domino of the free world that has been knocked out over by an autocratic influence. As one of the most respected democracies in the world, Canada has always been a place that Hong Kong people interact with and treasure. When Hong Kong was handed back to China in 1997, a wave of Hong Kongers came to Canada in search of a safe home that shared our love for liberty, humanity, and democracy. As the government crackdown intensified with the national security law, the Hong Kong people are grateful towards the swift response adopted by the Canadian government to safeguard our freedoms, including halting the export of military use goods and the extradition treaty with Hong Kong. Your Young Talent Scheme also came as a lifeline for the people who either face imminent dangers of political persecution at home or are in desperate need of protection and are looking for a new place to call home. We need to stop fantasizing that the Chinese Communist Party would become a strategic partner with the liberal democracies. History proves that they only abuse the openness of our system and erode it from whatever means they can imagine. The democracies need to join hands and to work together to safeguard the liberal values and stop China from spreading its ideology and controls over the regions. Therefore, I would like to recommend the following policy directions to curb the influence of the Chinese authoritarianism. For the short term, Magnitsky sanctions against human rights abusers, particularly those in Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang, should be in place. Furthermore, banning Huawei from participating in 5G, just like the other countries, developing a coherent asylum and refugee policies for Hong Kongers freeing persecutions are much needed. In the medium to long term, engaging with like-minded allies throughout the world to develop a pushback strategy against China's human rights abuses, hostage diplomacy, and cohesive trade practices. Developing closer economic, political, and security
Mr. Law,
ties
you're frozen
with Taiwan.
for a moment.
Okay, is it better now? Hello, can you hear me?
Uh-oh.
Okay, shall I continue?
Yes, please.
Okay, developing closer economic, political, and security ties with Taiwan, introducing legislation to combat foreign agents of influence in Canada, particularly targeting United Front activities. These policies are also crucial. We hope that the democratic communities around the world can stand together and to protect our shared democratic values. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Law. And now we'll go to our round of questions. First, we have from the Conservative Party, Mr. Garnet Jenis. Mr. Jenis, 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your engagement, your courage, and your presence with us here today. Ms. Gui, I'll start with you. Your situation, your family situation, highlights two key aspects of China's emerging kidnapping and hostage diplomacy. That is the denial of citizenship and the real risk of abduction from third countries. And for me, this sort of brings back the case of Hussein Chalil that we've talked about this committee before, who was a Canadian citizen whose citizenship has been denied, whose Canadian citizenship has been denied by China and by others, and who has not therefore been able to have consular access while in prison, and also who was abducted from Uzbekistan, from a third country. So I wonder if you could speak more to these elements, specifically. Should we be concerned that Canadian citizens detained in China or currently in Hong Kong could be forced to renounce their citizenship? And also, how concerned should we be about Canadian citizens being abducted from third countries? How should we respond to protect our citizens who may be vulnerable in third countries?
Thank you. Those are all very pertinent questions, and I'm happy to answer them. Yes, I think that I think that one should definitely be concerned about the risk of Canadian citizens being abducted in third countries, and also having their citizenships denied and potentially also changed, as in the case of my father. What happened to my father sets a very worrying precedent, which, to my knowledge, we haven't seen repeated yet. But I think it's imperative that nations such as Canada and other like-minded nations speak up in public and very clearly delineate that this is not something that we accept, and also to formulate very clear consequences to if this was to happen again. And I think that Mr. Law made some really good points as to what sort of specific measures could be taken. I think something that is that one could do in the short term to protect Canadian citizens who may be planning to travel to an area where there is significant Chinese influence, and something like this might happen, like Thailand in the case of my father, is to make sure that Chinese technology is not adopted beyond the point that it already has been in Canada, because this, as we're all aware, it has been known to spy on people, and perhaps especially people in vulnerable positions. I am pretty sure, for example, that one of the reasons that my father was able to be abducted in the way that he was because people were able to, or Chinese authorities were able to keep track of his habits and movements and plans.
Thank you. Let me get another question in for you. It's interesting that you're here before us advocating a strong approach, a strong response to the threat posed by the People's Republic of China in a way that protects ourselves and our citizens. Because there's been a bit of a debate in Canada in response to our own situation of hostage diplomacy. Some advocating a sort of concessional approach, even that in response to hostage taking, that we would make concessions in the context of Meng Wanzhou, for example, in order to try to elicit good behavior. Whereas you're taking the approach that we need to respond with strength in a way that's going to protect other people. I'm inclined to agree with you that that's the right approach. But I wonder if you could speak directly to those people in Canada who maybe are personally affected by the situation of hostage diplomacy, for whom these things are very, very raw and very close. Why you have taken the approach you have rather than recommending the concessional approach?
Thank you. That's an important question as well. I think that there are multiple layers to your question. There's a sense in which this is my decision to be here and advocate what I am is a personal decision, which I think goes on multiple levels, which is why I'm talking about it. I don't believe that making secessions is ever going to encourage the good behavior that some people might be expecting. I have family members who have chosen, or perhaps not really chosen. I mean, they've certainly felt that they didn't have a choice, that when they were contacted after my father was abducted and asked to remain silent, chose to do so. And they, though I can't divulge any any particular details about what happened, they are in a much worse situation today than I am. And I think this goes on a larger level as well, in the sense that China has historically never shown that it listens to sort of soft encouragements. I mean, as Nathan Law mentioned in his speech just now, I mean, many large world economies were hoping for a long time that China would be encouraged to open up.
Ms. Gui, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Genesis' time is up. So I'm going to have to go on to the next, but I hope you'll have more opportunity to expand on your thoughts. We have the next from the Liberal Party, Mr. Prajus for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'll put the question to Mr. Law first, but I'd also like Ms. Gui to comment on it. This idea that countries, liberal democracies to be specific, ought to work in concert, finding ways to sort out their relations with China. Countries can't, well, they can, I suppose, act on their own in that regard, but much better, I think an emerging opinion suggests that it's much better for countries to come together in that. It's all well and good to suggest that, though. I'd love to hear from both of you, since you have been working on these issues for so long and are quite invested. How can countries best do that in terms of the issues? Which issues should they focus on, and how can they best be heard in your view? Again, Mr. Law to begin with, and Ms. Gui, if you could follow up.
Thank you so much for your questions. I think, first of all, we need to build consensus. Consensus building is the most important way to push for political changes. I studied at Yale last year, and it was the period of time which the Hong Kong was having a massive movement, and headlines are all over Hong Kong. And we saw a process of consensus building across the political aisles.
Mr. Law, I'm sorry. Mr. Law, I'm sorry. I have to remind you to hold that microphone closer if you don't mind. I'm terribly sorry.
Sorry about that. Yes, last year we saw the consensus building process in the US across political aisles, which made the Hong Kong issue one of the very few topics that both parties could agree on, and then processed in a dramatic speed. So I think for now, I've been doing international advocacy work, mainly focusing on Europe. And I think that kind of consensus building process, it has been ongoing in Europe for at least past couple of months. So if we are going to work together for the liberal democracies, then we have to really consolidate that our China policy would definitely be seeing it as a very aggressive expansionist, and adopting measures, for example, building up the policies on Huawei, on state enterprise from China, and also, for example, really imminent issues like boycotting Winter Olympics, which we could send a really clear signal that we're not going to follow the old path of engagement and appeasement policy, but we are going to be a very assertive and proactive countries. Which
Mr. Law, I'm sorry, I didn't. Could you just repeat that point? And I wonder if it's the problems on my end. I heard you say boycotting, but I didn't hear you complete the phrasing there.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was talking about boycotting the Winter Olympic, the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympic, in order to create a more like consequence-based relationship with them, rather than just letting them doing whatever they want. So I think building up an alliance with the other liberal democracies and creating policies like that could definitely be helpful to constrain their authoritarian expansion. Thank you.
Ms. Gui?
Thank you. I very much second what has been said already, but would perhaps just like to add that, yes, I think it's very important too that strategic alliances are formed between like-minded liberal democracies. And I think in order for this to be realistic, in that it will have an effect, I think that much more of an effort needs to be put into organizing the coming together of high-level officials from each interested countries to come together and actively sit down and discuss what are the policies that we want to enact together to stop Chinese influence in this in the way that it has been developing. I think one major problem that I've seen is that countries have been very keen to sign joint letters, which is all fine and well. I believe that it's a positive thing to see the intention from many countries, but as we've seen in the past, such declarations of intent haven't really achieved anything yet. And so I wish that liberal democracies could use the momentum to discuss in more realistic and in more constructive terms what we can agree that we will actually do together in coordination.
45 seconds, Mr. Prajakatis.
Well, thank you very much. I think both of you have put your finger on particular pressure points that would be noticed by the Chinese state and this leadership in particular. I ask the question simply because there are so many different possibilities for the let's say alliance of liberal democracies when it forms around this issue, and I hope it will. To focus on that, we need very specific points to suggest and to think about, certainly in relation to the advice that we provide our own government here in Canada. So with that, I think I'll leave it there. And thank you very much for all the work that you're doing to advocate for human rights.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prajakatis. Monsieur Bergeron, 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank Ms. Gouy and Mr. Law for their comments, for their extremely enlightening comments for the work of this committee. I would like to congratulate them on their courage for accepting to appear before us despite the legitimate concerns that they might have following what happened to them and what has happened to members of their family. So congratulations. One of the concerns that we have and have had since the outset is that this fear that some witnesses might have to appear before this committee. This leads us to think of the modus operandi of the Chinese government's activities outside of its borders. If you take the comments that were just made about some people who were kidnapped, be it in Hong Kong or elsewhere, for example in Thailand, we have to wonder the following. I have three things. First of all, does the People's Republic of China have agents abroad? And I think this is a question that would be of great interest to Mr. Paul Hughes, our colleague. He would like us to look quickly at the question of security and the influence of the People's Republic of China in Canada. So are there any foreign agents to carry out intimidation or even arrests? And my second point is the following. Does it require the complicity of states where any kidnappings may occur? Take Thailand. Are there any indications that Thailand could have been an accomplice to the kidnapping of Mr. Gui on its territory? And thirdly, it's the lack of power that countries have when they have nationals that have been imprisoned in China. Take the example of a Canadian who had dual citizenship. We've talked about this a great deal in this committee. The People's Republic of China does not recognize the Canadian citizenship of that national. And in the case of Mr. Gui, China does not recognize his Swedish citizenship. So I think there are a number of facets here, number of things that states could do to find themselves not isolated from China. We have to look at China's modus operandi abroad. I was wondering if you have anything to say that would shed some light on these matters for our committee. Ms. Gui and Mr. Law. Ms. Gui, go ahead.
I think those are all excellent questions and points. I can start by addressing the point about my father's abduction from Thailand in 2015. Yes, I personally believe, although it hasn't been conclusively shown, that Thai authorities were complicit in the abduction of my father. He, for example, left his passport behind when he was kidnapped and had to have it renewed during the period that he was in house arrest in 2017. And there were the only thing that Thai authorities have said, to my knowledge, about this incident is that they had no record of him ever leaving Thailand. Thai authorities have not seemed willing to assist in any investigation of what happened to my father, which is something that concerns me greatly. On the other point of Canadian dual nationals potentially being subjected to the same treatment as my father, I will also just emphasize that my father is, in fact, solely a Swedish national. He does not have Chinese citizenship. He went through the process of renouncing it actively, which is quite a long and arduous process. This didn't seem to matter, and I think that it may have quite harrowing implications for Canadian citizens as well.
Mr. Law, you have 1 minute.
Well, yes, definitely. I think for us, especially an activist for me, I've been engaging in political activism for around 6 years. I've been avoiding going to places which their relationships are quite friendly to China, and Thailand is one of the places. So for me, it's clear that these authoritarian regimes, they are highly possible of colluding or cooperating with each other. And for activists like us, we have to be very careful. And yes, indeed, the reason why these hearing and the other hearings, there are no activists from Hong Kong who are based in Hong Kong, who are still physically in Hong Kong, willing to participate. There's reason for that is because they will draw much repercussion for them.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Bergeron, merci beaucoup. Et maintenant, we have now Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of the witnesses for coming forward today. And I want to congratulate you and commend you both on your courage that you've shown in the face of a very strong situation where the government is very powerful and have exercised that power in strong ways against your father in particular, Ms. Gui, and against you personally, Mr. Law. Let me ask you first, you've left, of course, the day before the national security law was imposed and are now living in the UK. Since being there, we've heard from time to time that the UK was expected to impose what are often referred to as Magnitsky sanctions, and I think after a long debate, one way and the other, they finally adopted this similar type legislation as other countries have. Not very many, of course. What's the expectation in terms of what the UK might do in the foreseeable future?
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, indeed, the Magnitsky Act, we are all hoping that these sanctions could apply on the Chinese officials, but for now it isn't the case. So we're trying to push forward for that enactment in order to really hold these Chinese officials accountable. And a similar sanctioning mechanism, I believe, will possibly be in place for the EU in the upcoming future. So I also hope that that could apply on the Chinese officials on Uyghurs concentration camp and other human rights violation happening in China. And in the upcoming future, for the UK government, they have been sorting out the BNO scheme, which allows millions of Hong Kong people to come to the UK and to get citizenship in the long term. This is seen as a really beneficial scheme for Hong Kong people. And also, for me, I'm actively interacting with the government in order to expand that to the young people who are most in need. And for the other mechanism, like high scrutiny on Chinese enterprise in the UK and the other policies that could really curb the influence of the Chinese Communist Party overseas. I think these are directions that the UK government has been moving to, and I hope that the Europe and the other European countries could also shift to that direction.
Perhaps I should be more specific, because I obviously expressed the hope that that would happen. The UK has had a policy change, and they're dealing with people who were already passport holders who hold passports in the UK and are therefore already able to come to the UK under existing passports. And they've made some policy changes, which is, I would venture to suggest, fairly easy to do. Is there, and you're expressing the hope that they may impose sanctions, but they've had plenty of time to do that. And I'm just wondering, do you have any realistic expectation that the government will actually do that? Because I haven't heard anything of late indicating that they are doing more than what they've announced already. Now, they have made some suggestions that they will make it easier for students who come to the UK to study to stay longer, which is again a policy change, which is very positive. But I'm interested in this question of sanctions, because there are only 7 or 8 countries who actually have this type of legislation, and maybe more will come. But I'm looking as to how what mechanisms might be used to when you talk about, and when we talk in Canada about an alliance of countries who are seeking to make it difficult for the authorities who violate human rights and who act in the ways that we're talking about, that we would like to influence. What mechanisms are available in addition to the Magnitsky-type sanctions, which we haven't yet seen from other countries and other than the U.S.?
Thank you once again for your question. I think the foreign minister has also talked about it, and they have considered it, and they have not said that it is impossible. So for me, a continual dialogue with them is crucial, and I hope that this could be done in the future for the second or third round of the Magnitsky Act sanction. And for me, it's important that we work together, not only on the sanction mechanism, but for example, if all the liberal democracies, we decide to add human rights clauses when we have a trade agreement with China, then it is impossible for China to have a leeway to try to mingle and to do business with one and not to do it with the other, in order to circumventing this kind of a united effort from all the liberal democracies. So I think the problem is we still don't have a concrete mechanism, just like Ms. Gui said, that the leaders could sit together and work out a plan in order to hold China accountable. So for me, the problem is not what policies that we could do, but an intention and a mechanism that all these countries could work together.
Thank you very much, Mr. Law, Mr. Harris. And now we are on to the second round, and Mr. Chong, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Gui, thank you for taking the time to tell your heartbreaking story about Hong Kong. It sent chills up my spine. My late father was a Hong Konger who went to high school there, grew up there, was born there, but he began his studies at university in mainland southern China, and it was just over 70 years ago, as the communists began their march south in 1948, that he fled on one of the last trains back to Hong Kong. And like your father, he never held Chinese citizenship, but rather a British Hong Kong passport. But he told us when we were kids that he would never go back to mainland China for fear of being abducted. And so your story, I sent chills up my spine, and I thank you for telling that. And good afternoon, Mr. Law. Thank you for taking the time to appear. It's good to see you again, and I'm glad to see that you're safe and well. My first question is for Ms. Gui. Has the Swedish government done anything with respect to Thai authorities arresting your father, and have they done anything with respect to the People's Republic of China?
Thank you for sharing your family's story. This actually ties into the first question I think that I was asked as well, the second question about potentially making secessions. My experience has been that Sweden has been hesitant in its response to China's human rights violations of my father, but also in general. And as we have seen, that has not been effective. With regards to communications with Thailand, I do not have full insight into the sort of all the bilateral communications, of course, but I am aware that there were questions asked, but I think that they weren't asked in public, which I hoped that they would have been.
Okay. Has the European Union made any public statement about China's violation of the Vienna Convention with respect to your father?
There was a European Parliament resolution. There's been two, I believe. I don't think that they have mentioned the violation of the Vienna Convention specifically. I may be wrong, but to the best of my recollection, I don't think so. No.
These resolutions were with respect to your father?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Law, you were elected to the Legislative Council of the Special Administrative Region of Hong Kong. What impact has the absence of pro-democracy candidates had on the functioning of LegCo, and what impact has it had on Hong Kongers' view of LegCo?
Well, after a series of disqualification, which the candidates running for the council and the sitting parliamentarians are being disqualified over the past few years, I believe that Hong Kong people already view the Legislative Council as merely a puppet council from the Chinese government, because the Hong Kong people cannot enjoy the rights of electing their representations fairly. So for me, yes, indeed, its legitimacy is largely challenged, and Hong Kong people less and less believe in the change in the system, and that's why there were like protests broke out last year so massively, because they stopped believing in participating in the system that could make a concrete change.
Okay, thank you. I remember sitting around the cabinet table in 2006 when we had to evacuate thousands of Canadians from the conflict in Lebanon. So I ask this question in the context of the 300,000 Canadians living in Hong Kong. In your estimation, at what point do we see a tipping point where there could be a mass exodus of Hong Kongers seeking to leave the Special Administrative Region?
Well, I think for now, at least, it is unlikely to happen, because Beijing still tries to target not that massive amounts of people. So it is not in the foreseeable future. But I think other than like exiting plan, concrete help to those individuals in Hong Kong, Canadian Hong Kongese are crucial. So I think we should develop plans on that direction.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chong. Et maintenant, Monsieur Dubourg, pendant 5 minutes.
Dubourg for 2 minutes. I would like to share my time with my colleague Jean. But first of all, I would like to greet Ms. Gui and Mr. Law and thank them for their presence. As my colleagues have said before, I would like to state also that I admire your exceptional courage. The question that I would like to ask you is, I know that Ms. Gui, you are here, and I would like to understand the influence of the Chinese government beyond its borders. So I don't know whether you would be in a position to tell us, because I don't want to create any safety issues for you, but what can you tell us personally, what kind of measures you took to make sure that you're protected? And what can the Canadian government do to accompany you in this, Ms. Gui?
This has been something that I have worried about daily for the entirety of the 5 years that I've been doing this. I don't, like Mr. Law, I suspect I don't travel to many places that I wish I could travel to, where China has influence. I have been subjected to many intimidation attempts here in the UK, where I'm based, but also in Sweden, in Germany, and other places. Mostly, this has been in the form of intrusive, threatening photography, but it's also been, but it's also happened through an attempted break-in. It has, early last year, I was involved in an influence operation. My apologies. An influence operation where I suspect that Chinese agents were involved, where the then Swedish ambassador to Beijing invited me to a meeting in Stockholm with 2 Chinese businessmen, where I was in a hotel lounge for 72 hours, and was made to feel I couldn't leave, and that I had to be quiet about my father's case, otherwise I would never get to see him again. That was what they said. And so, of course, it's very hard in these circumstances to know how you can protect yourself. And it's never a straightforward thing, unfortunately. I have to make sure that I minimize the information that I give out when I communicate, even using encrypted apps. I don't tell people about my whereabouts. I worry about communicating with friends who may have Huawei phones or Huawei routers, and that's actually maybe the most sort of concrete and short-term recommendation that I can make to that end. I mean, other than studying and following Chinese influence and intimidation in Canada, I would also recommend that Canada tries to limit the expansion of Chinese technology to help protect people in my situation.
Monsieur Dubourg, vous êtes en sourdine.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Time is flying, but just 1 minute while Mr. Law, I know that you are one of the 6 persons that qu'on cherche à...
Well, one of the 6 persons that are being that one tries to arrest. So how do you personally live with this situation in the UK?
Much for the questions, and the simple answer is I cannot go back to Hong Kong, and I'm living a life of exile. And from now on, my life is committed to international advocacy work for the democratic movement of Hong Kong.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Dubourg.
Thank you, Mr. Dubourg. Let's move now to Mr. Bergeron, 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to piggyback on the question that was asked by my colleague, Emmanuel Dubourg, especially because this does cover, some aspect of my own question, a question that has not received a full answer yet. I understand that the risk of being abducted or being arrested outside of the territory are probably more likely or probable in regimes close to the Chinese regime. But would you also say that despite everything, that there are also risks of being abducted in countries which are less close of the Chinese communist regime, for example, Canada or the UK? Or what about, in those cases, is it more, a matter of harassment towards dissidents, Chinese dissidents or activists?
C'est posé à Monsieur Law or Madame Gui?
A question to Mr. Law or Ms. Gui?
I always dare not to say that I'm completely safe. We understand how far-reaching the influence of Chinese Communist Party could be. So I tried to be.
Mr. Law, sorry to interrupt again, but please hold your microphone.
Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, I dare not to say that I'm completely safe, and we all understand how extensive China's reach could be. So for the past couple of months since I left Hong Kong, I've been living in a discreet life and tried to keep a low profile. So I didn't really appear to any public speaking or events.
Ms. Gui?
Madame Gui?
Ms. Gui?
Very briefly, what happened to my father, which was being abducted from Thailand, was then unprecedented. And I think that based on that, we won't, I think it's reasonable to assume, given China's expansion of its repression of human rights, that abductions may happen in the future in countries like Canada or other Western democracies. Yes.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Monsieur.
Minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And Ms. Gui, you just referred to a potential concern about potential abductions in Canada. When you talked about Thailand, you indicated that there was a complicity or potential complicity by the Thai government and, of course, a lack of protection from Sweden. Given the concerns that have been raised, and we will hear from some of them soon on our committee by Canadians about whether they ought to be afraid. What should the government of Canada do to protect its citizens in potential situations like that? Do you have any suggestions? I realize you're not an expert in this field, but you know what? It makes me feel that there's a vulnerability there, and the government should be doing something that it's not doing.
Thank you. Yes, I am not an expert in this field, but I do. Some thoughts do come to mind. The first one is to make sure that Canada's consulates and embassy in China expand its capabilities to monitor human rights abuses, and also make sure that and also make sure that citizens can come to consulates or the embassy with their safety concerns. I also think that oh no, I completely lost my train of thought. Sorry, would you mind repeating?
No, I think, well, yes, that's something that's important within Hong Kong or within China. I guess I'm asking the reverse of that. You say where Thailand failed your father and Sweden failed your father, how can Canada make sure that people in its own country, citizens of Canada or Chinese citizens within Canada, what should we make sure that we are doing to ensure that this doesn't happen on our soil?
Thank you for the reminder. Sorry about that. Yes, well, I think something that Canada could do, and which I'm hoping that more governments will also do, is to issue issue a travel warning or a travel advisory for travels to China. But then also I realized that your question concerns abductions in Canada. I think that taking a stronger stance in general against China and in public, and doing so through imposing targeted sanctions, similar to the Magnitsky-style sanctions that we've seen other countries talking about adopting, could send the message to China that this is something that Canada will not accept.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Gui. Thank you, Mr. Harris. Colleagues, we're now over our time. I want to thank our witnesses very much. I know we all appreciate your attendance today and have certainly been affected by your testimony. Thank you so much. And the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you very much.